Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I think this is one of the first videos in the new studio space, so I hope you like it. Today's video is going to be a tutorial on how to paint E-11D. So this is the blaster for the Rogue One Death Troopers. Had a client who had a 3D printed one, and they had finished it and did a little bit of priming, but I'm going to show you how to paint this up with this really cool chrome finish and the whole scorched end on here. You're going to need a few materials that you might not have, maybe some tools you might not have. You'll need an airbrush and some specialty paints, but it's going to be awesome, so stay tuned.
Okay, I'm using a combination here of Duplicolor paints and Krylon paints. I find that you can use both of them interchangeably, but not Rust-Oleum. Generally, I'm not a huge fan of Rust-Oleum. So I'm using Duplicolor Hot Rod Black for the primer, Satin Black, which is the main top coat for a finish for the blaster, and I'm using Krylon Gloss Black for the muzzle. I'm also using a gloss clear as well, which I don't show here, but I'll show it later on while I'm painting. Of course, for safety reasons, making sure that you're using a properly Niosh approved respirator. I've got two different kinds that I use sometimes. Make sure you've got the right one and that you're working in a well ventilated space. And I usually use some nitrile gloves too, just so that my hands don't get super messy. It's always good to keep your work area clean. So just a little trick, I'll usually warm up the cans just to warm up the paint. It'll thin out the paint a bit and give it a little bit more pressure. So I'm going to start off with some Hot Rod Black, making sure that the blaster is evenly coated. I'm just demonstrating here. After the paint's cured, I give it a light scuff with a fine Scotch-Brite pad just to smooth out the paint, and then I'll use a tack cloth, which is used in auto body finishing work. Basically, you fold it up to a clean side of the cloth. It's got a sticky, sort of tacky residue to it, and you just wipe down your blaster, and that'll remove any sort of extra dust particles and stuff like that. Make sure you got a nice clean finish before you start painting. So here I am. I'm about to put on the first few coats of the Satin Black. I find Satin Black works better for photos and videography rather than using flat black. Flat black just tends to wash out in the background. So I'm dusting on a few, a bit, very light coat to start with, and then I think I applied about maybe 2 more coats, so about 3 coats total. To make sure that I could get to areas of the blaster that I couldn't reach, I stuck a PVC pipe up into the barrel, and I just used a clamp that I clamped onto a table, and there you go. Now you got a little stand, right? After that satin coat's dried, I masked off the flashlight that's on the side of the barrel, and then what I did was I top coated the end of the barrel with the gloss black. Okay, so this is going to be like the prep work for the chrome. If you notice, I'm kind of only going up to about where the flashlight area is, and after that area cured, I use some Krylon clear gloss. And it's important to use these two paints in particular because they will yield the best finish for the chrome finish. So you can see here it's nice and glossy now. I got the gloss black and I got the gloss clear. And for the chrome, we're going to be using Alclad II Lacquer, which is a chrome paint. Be putting that in my single action airbrush. I got 3 different airbrushes, dual action, single action, but this one works really good for props. It's really simple to use. I'll maybe have a separate video about airbrushing, but you can pour the paint right into the cup, and basically I start airbrushing the muzzle on all the way around. Try to get it as even as possible around the end of the muzzle. I basically put about 3 or 4 coats on, and really it wasn't even a little cup full of that paint on the side of that airbrush. It was maybe like about half full. And after that paint has dried, it dries fairly quickly. I peel off the masking for the flashlight, and then to make sure that the transition area between the chrome and the satin black is still even, I kind of went back in and just dusted the transition with a little bit of satin black, and that just made it look a little bit better. Now, I normally would have airbrushed the sort of rainbow colors, the scorch marks on the side of the barrel separately, like before the entire blaster was built, but this particular client had already assembled the blaster, so I needed a way to ensure that I could rotate the blaster around evenly, because I wanted those scorch marks really even. So I just did something really simple here. I just screwed together a wood bracket and then attached it to a base, just a little square block of MDF, and I've got a little plastic Lazy Susan. That's that round spinny thing that you put in your cabinet for dishes. But all I did was fire some holes here, put some screws in, and screwed in this bracket, and then I used zip ties to attach the blaster to it. Now you can see here I can kind of spin it around on the Lazy Susan really evenly, and I didn't have any extra long zip ties, so I just put a couple of them together and attached the blaster to this sort of make-do bracket, but it worked out really, really well. So this is something you can do if you've already assembled your blaster, all right? So now I'm going to just sort of demonstrate. It takes a little bit of fiddling to kind of get the muzzle centered on the rotational center of the Lazy Susan, but this makes for spinning it around a lot easier. Now I'm going to be using my Alclad II Transparent Yellow. For the first section of the Scorch Marks, I'll be using transparent blue as well. That'll be the last color. And then in between the two, I'll be using a transparent red. And you'll see that the colors kind of mix together when I airbrush them. So here, I'm just going around very slowly, putting on that sort of first layer of the yellow. The yellow is obviously going to transition to an orange before it comes into the red. So kind of think about where you're laying your colors. You don't want to make them like a rainbow, like where they're totally distinct colors. You want to overlap them by about 50%. So just going, taking my time and applying the yellow and then the red and then the blue, and I'm overlapping the colors as I go, and just making sure that I've got a nice even finish on all three colors. These lacquers dry very, very quickly, so you don't have to wait too long, but you always want to be careful when you handle them because it is quite gentle, right, this paint. For the end of the blaster, you saw there, I was actually just airbrushing a little black, a little bit of matte black into the muzzle so that it didn't look like shiny chrome all the way down. And here I'm using some frog masking tape for the white lines. Just being really careful with masking off areas that I don't want any of the white paint to go onto. I know in some of the reference material you actually see the white lines go all the way down to the end of the barrel, but I didn't really like that look, so I basically faded the lines off as we got to the end of the barrel, so it didn't look like, that way it wouldn't look like pinstripe tape all the way down, right? That's just kind of my take on the blaster. You can do it however you like. So I'm just going by the reference photos and masking off these sections. I'm leaving about a 1/8 inch gap between the different sections of tape, and I'm using like a ruler or straight edge just to cut the tape at 90-degree angles so that I can get these nice kind of angled lines, right? And now I'm using some removable low-tack green masking tape. I would advise against using blue tape or sort of that cream-colored tape on a painted prop like this, because those tapes have a tendency to peel or pull the paint off. You want something that'll come off really easily. So now I'm starting to airbrush some white, which I think I forgot to call out in the materials, but you want to get some white acrylic paint or lacquer based, and just very gently airbrushing in those lines. You don't need a ton of coats. I think I did maybe about 3 airbrush passes on each of these striped line areas, and it turned out really, really well. So you can also notice I didn't mask off the entire blaster. I was trying to be conservative on the use of my tape there, but I find I've gotten pretty good at that kind of stuff. So just mask it off so you don't get white overspray all over your newly printed or newly painted blaster. So here I'm just peeling off all the masking tape. Pinstripe turned out really nice. Being really careful about the tape at the end of that muzzle, making sure that I'm not pulling off any of the chrome or the Scorch Mark rainbow color, but I'm super, super happy with the way that that turned out. So here I'm just finishing off some of the other pinstripe areas in white. Just again being really careful not to lay on the paint super thick. I know the video is sped up, but I'm actually doing 3 light coats to make sure that the paint isn't overly loading the area and potentially seeping underneath the masking tape. You definitely don't want that to happen. But yeah, it looks super good. There's another spot on the right side of the blaster. After that's done, I moved on to some of the detail areas. You're going to need some yellow acrylic and some red acrylic as well too. You can use lacquer based if you want, but acrylic is what I had on hand at the moment. So yeah, I airbrushed in some of those details. Any areas that I got overspray on, I used a little bit of black acrylic just to kind of touch up around some of the corners, and that's just a cheap trick to kind of hide any mistakes or flubs that you might have made. Here I am moving on to some of the weathering. I basically used 3 different colors of acrylic and mixed up almost a chocolate milk brown type color. And all you're going to do is wet down your paintbrush with water, and then dip it into the paint, scrub a little bit of it off, and then basically kind of dab it into the recessed areas of the blaster. So usually I like to start with the underside of the blaster, because if I make a mistake or I don't like the color, I can kind of cover it up and no one's really going to see it. But what I'm really focusing on is trying to get that dirt color into sort of the deeper recesses, of all the sort of cracks and crevices of the blaster, where dirt would settle, right? So imagine you're running around the beaches of Scariff. Where would all that sand and all that dirt go if after the battle you wiped it down with a rag to clean it off? Where would all that dirt settle? That's what I did. So what I do is I just dab the paint in, and then you saw in the clip there, I just sprayed a little bit of water on a rag, and then I kind of dab and in a circular motion just kind of rub it off. With this sort of weathering method, you don't want to use paint strokes. You don't want to like stroke back and forth with the brush. You want to just dab, okay? And again, you're not dabbing it all over the blaster. You're just doing it in areas where you think the dirt will settle. So I kind of focus on areas where gravity would pull dirt into. All right, so you're not putting a ton of dirt necessarily on the very top of the blaster. It's probably going to settle along the bottom and the sides a little bit more. So I'm constantly wetting that rag, not making it too wet, but I'm kind of just, again, in a circular motion, kind of like rubbing off the excess paint. And in reality, when you dab all this paint on the blaster, you're actually going to rub off, I don't know, like 80% of it, right? So very little of it is actually going to stay. And after you've done, the weathering to your liking, I take a clean part of the rag, making sure I've got, just water on it, and just kind of re-wiping it, because what happens is as you're wiping all the weathering off, you might sort of see this sort of white haze develop from your cloth that you're using. It's just basically dirty. So just using a clean part of the cloth, wipe it off, and you'll be all good. And this is one of my favorite parts. I basically take some silver acrylic and a very flat-edged paintbrush, and you're basically just dry brushing some of the high spots on the blaster. You're going to use very, very little paint. I probably used about maybe 2 dabs of that silver, and you can see I get a bit of paint on the brush, and then I'm actually sort of scrubbing most of the paint off. And then all I'm going to do is dab it on the high spots of the blaster. Now, all too often I see people do this. They kind of go way too heavy on this, and they sort of highlight every single edge of their prop that they're doing. You really don't need to do that. You really want to just focus on areas that are going to get chipped or bumped into. I call them the sticky outy bits, right? So just because you see a raised edge doesn't mean that you need to put a silver highlight on it. I'm doing it everywhere where the blaster might have been bumped into, areas where parts come in and out, like the magazine, places where your hands might go. In particular, the trigger, or sorry, the butt of the grip itself. Again, I'm not doing long strokes. I'm just sort of doing little dabs. The trigger for sure, and the trigger guard. The rear butt of the stock is probably going to get a lot of abuse from being rested vertically on the ground, or maybe it gets bumped into something, or they're using the blaster to hit somebody with it, right? So also those horizontal rods that hold the extendable part of the stock in place, and the knobs too, all these sort of adjustment knobs. You're definitely going to want to like highlight all these sort of little ridges, right? So here, this is a great spot where I'm just highlighting that bottom end of that stock. It's going to bring a lot of detail, because there's all these sort of wonderful sculptural or 3D modeled and printed details, so why not show them off, right? But again, don't go crazy. You don't need to do every single edge, okay? I am doing a little bit of dry brushing, like some strokes kind of to simulate some scuff marks, and then sometimes I like to take the brush and do kind of like little random dots here and there, so just to kind of make it look like paint's been chipped off. Here I'm doing the edges of those oval holes as well too, just to make them look like there's a little bit more damage. And that's about it for the silver. So the last part is I take a little bit of black, and I'll go back in and dry brush over any spots that I might have messed up on with the silver, or in this particular case, I'll go back over that pinstriping to make it look like there's some areas that have been chipped or scuffed or scraped off. And now here's the completed blaster. So it turned out super nice. I think I'm I really liked the way that it turned out, and the client liked the way that it turned out. Again, they supplied it as a completed 3D print, and they had coated it with an epoxy, a fiberglass epoxy, which caused some issues. I had a few chips and things like that show up, but in the end I was able to patch it up, and I was super happy with the way it turned out, and they were happy with it too. So I hope you like this tutorial and that it's helpful for everybody. Thanks for tuning in.